Armed conflict has been with us since the dawn of civilization. Archaeologists have unearthed evidence of armies as far back as 10,000 BC. Military history has always existed on a grand scale, with legendary battles fought on land, sea, and air. From ancient daggers to modern medals of honor, in expert hands, these relics reveal the stories of those who are no longer here to speak for themselves. Join us as we unlock the secrets of Militaria. Today on Militaria, we will look at a gunner with unmatched night vision, siblings who made the ultimate sacrifice for freedom, as well as a hand-carved walking cane that tells a touching story of human connection. Andrew Moss looks at a walking cane that was gifted to a prison guard, given by a prisoner of war in Ally-occupied Germany.
This is a cane that was given to my father the year after the war. He was a prison guard that escorted prisoners to the trials.
Mark People looks at service medals and a distinguished flying cross awarded to Clarence Bentley Sutherland, the one-eyed gunner.
His full name was Clarence Bentley Sutherland, but he was known to his friends as Larry. He was a 23-year-old farm boy from East Mountain, Nova Scotia.
Andrew Moss looks at a collection of World War I medals and documents passed down from brothers who all served.
He had 5 brothers, went to war. 2 were killed in action, so only 3 of them came home. My name is Sherry Mallard. I brought in my grandfather's medals. The medals and artifacts were given to me by my mother. He had some pay books and lots of pictures and some documents from the war. She got them from her grandfather. They were given to my mother, and eventually they're coming to me.
Canadian valor in the First World War was unquestioned. Canadians held the line at Ypres as the Germans unleashed the first poison gas attack of the war. Canadians fought through the mud and blood-drenched battlefield at Passchendaele and at Vimy Ridge, where the solemn and majestic Canadian National Vimy Memorial now stands. Many historians say Canadian soldiers helped forge our national identity. Those historic and heroic victories came at a cost. Canada had a population of less than 8 million in 1914, but over 650,000 Canadians served in the First World War. More than a quarter of them were wounded, and 1 in 10 died.
These items were my great-grandfather's from World War I. There's some pay books, pictures, and medals.
These are a standard set of World War I medals. This is the 1415 Star, the British War Medal, and the Victory Medal. You also have a patriotic flag here. This was actually a common piece during the First World War that you would bring to parades, welcoming troops home, or any kind of rallies. Here you have the pay books of your great-grandfather, Alfred Lloyd. And in this would be where all his pay information would be, and often you'll see it'll show different battles. This one's a later war version, so it doesn't have as much information, but still very nice to have it complete with the group. They're a standard set of medals, but the 1415 Star is really for those that qualified for it by being overseas earlier in the war, so 1914 to 1915. Your great-grandfather, I understood, joined up in 1914, which was very early. I think it was September of 1914.
Yes.
So quite early joiner, and that's why he's qualifying for this medal, which is the 1415 Star. His name, rank, and serial number are on the back, and on the other medals, it's actually on the edge. This actually goes back to the Victorian period, where Queen Victoria decided to honor British soldiers who served on campaign by giving them a medal that is named and inscribed to them and their regiment. So this started in 1837, and this continued up until the First World War. So that's why Commonwealth medals are all named and numbered to that individual. So right here we have a patriotic flag from the period, and you can see it's got all the flags of the different Commonwealth that were participating in the First World War. So missing the original wooden stick that would have been on. But yeah, very nice. It's like on an oilcloth. You also brought in a photograph of the brothers. And the entire family of brothers signed up to serve in the First World War. There was no prohibition against having siblings serving in the same regiment. I do have children, and I could say quite honestly that I would worry every second of the time that they're away. You said 2 had not survived?
Yes, 2 were killed in action.
Very, very symbolic of Canada's sacrifices in the First World War. Do you have any memories of your great-grandfather?
I was very young when he passed away, but I do remember that he was very hard of hearing.
As is typical for artillery troops.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
Man, I remember him going in the backyard and sitting by himself under a tree, and we weren't allowed to bother him, but very quiet.
And I understand that he also took a bride overseas.
He did, yes. My great-grandfather was actually born in England. His family immigrated to Montreal. And when he went back to the war, I guess he went back to the same neighborhood that he had lived in prior to. And my great-grandmother lived on that same street that he used to live on in England. And they ended up getting married, and he brought her to Montreal.
Well, as you can imagine, young Canadian soldiers going overseas, young people are young people, and of course, you have to remember, your average Canadian soldier was between 18, 17, 19 years old, or 20 years old, and going overseas and, finding love, amongst all the carnage. Alfred would have gone over in late 1914 and would have arrived in England in 1915 with the Battle of Vimy Ridge, which was basically a battle that was completely run by the Canadians. The Canadian Corps, as it was known, and 4 divisions of Canadians fought all together. Canada gave 620,000 personnel to the war effort. At the time, it was the thing to do, to join up and defend the Commonwealth. We took about 10% casualties during that war.
From my understanding, the 2 brothers that died in the war, they left behind widows with very young children. One was pregnant at the time, and I think the other one had 2 very young children. So it would have been hard, I think, for the brides at home.
It's a tragedy, those 7 brothers that went over to fight, 2 didn't come home. What would have happened had they come home? Their families wouldn't have been broken. And so that's, to me, when I look at something like that, that's what I think about. I really think about the cost of war. It really speaks to the sacrifice that Canada suffered due to the casualties involved in a war.
I did learn some things, and I'm very interested to go back and preserve these documents and keep them safe, and hopefully for another 100 years.
So did you have any plans for this grouping?
Well, currently it's all sitting in a little box, and I would like to display it somehow.
Did you want to keep them in the family? I think that's great. You appreciate your family's Canadian military history. What I would do personally is I would get these court-mounted and placed in a shadow box with the pay books put in there as well, and a reproduction picture, get a laser photocopy of the original picture. It's a grouping that belonged to an average Canadian that went over to defend England, but it really speaks to the sacrifice that Canada suffered due to the casualties involved in a war.
I would like to pass it down. I like to keep it as a collection and all together and not separate it. I hope one of my boys will want it.
Coming up on Militaria.
He was a professional gunfighter. That's what he did, and he did it very well. Otherwise, he wouldn't have survived, or his first or second cruise wouldn't have survived. Hello, my name is Gary Chisholm. I brought in today my uncle's medals, his Distinguished Flying Cross and Bar, along with his 3 other service medals. Gregarious, outgoing, an amazing sense of humor. He was my hero and my friend.
The term flying ace conjures images of a fearless pilot making aerobatic maneuvers, locking onto their target, and sending their opponents streaking toward the earth in a trail of smoke. That may have been true of some World War II dogfights, but the reality of most aerial combat was far less romantic. One of the most nerve-wracking jobs in the skies over Europe was that of a gunner aboard a bomber. Bombers were bigger, slower, and less agile than fighter planes. Gunners were the bomber's defense from attack, and they had a high mortality rate. Yet some beat the odds through skill and good fortune, and attained the title of flying ace by sending 5 or more enemy aircraft down in flames.
So we have the artifacts from your uncle, and your uncle was...
My uncle was Clarence Bentley Sutherland, but he was known to his friends as Larry. He was a 23-year-old farm boy from East Mountain, Nova Scotia.
We've got his actual logbook that he recorded his missions and his operations on, and his medals. And the medals here are pretty special because we're seeing an example of a DFC, a Distinguished Flying Cross, with a bar. That means that he was awarded that medal twice, which is an accomplishment you don't see often. And if we've got a number of other medals included in this set, we've got the 1939 to 45 Star, the Aircrew Europe Medal, the Defense Medal, and the Canadian Volunteer Service Medal, and finally the World War II Medal. The other great item that we have is Larry's flight logbook. This historic item is basically all the missions he took. If we look at the date, we're at July 1944. They were actually bombing France at this point.
That's correct.
So this is post-D-Day. We're bombing the French coastline, supporting the Canadian troops on the ground, and the British Army as they move across Normandy. We've written down, shot down ME-109, shot down FW-1A, shot down Ju-88, attacked 5 times. And if we look at the combat report, we can actually see that the battle that they had with these aircraft was actually a rolling battle. As they came back across the channel, the first aircraft they shot down was at 1:01, the next one was at 1:37, and then the final aircraft was at 2:02 in the morning. So Larry was basically a farm boy from Nova Scotia. He joined the RCF, was trained in Canada. What motivated him to join?
Larry was a natural marksman. He could light matches with a .22 rifle. Just an extraordinary shot. So he went down to Toronto to apply, and they turned him down because he had what is known now as Duane syndrome. His left eye wouldn't move right or left or up and down. Other than that, he had terrific vision in the eye. So 7 times, actually 6 times, and on the 7th time, he went to the major in charge of recruitment. And he said, I would think that, prerequisite an air gunner is to be able to shoot. I could shoot. And if you want, I'll bring in my .22 and I'll show you. He was accepted into the Air Force at that time. What that condition gave him was phenomenal night vision. If you can imagine in that rear turret, half of it is open to the night air. It's just extremely cold. And you're gazing out into the blackness behind that aircraft. And you're trying to pick out a dot that's blacker than the black. And that dot is coming at you at 350 miles an hour with a 20mm cannon to kill you. Because the eye didn't move, that's what gave him the edge with his gunnery and being a natural marksman.
Let's talk about Larry's tour. What was it actually like?
It's very, very difficult to describe the courage that it took for any member of that aircrew that climb on that aircraft. In the early days, life expectancy was 4 missions. And he did 26 missions. Shot down his first aircraft, got his first DFC. And one night they shot down 2 German night fighters on one mission. But the mission, the 3 German night fighters that were shot down, got him his 2nd Distinguished Flying Cross. The final mission they flew, they went in and they got chewed up badly. They lost 2 engines. They were losing altitude. They crossed the strait to England. When they got there, they found a crash airport, so he greased the Lancaster in on the grass strip beside the runway. And when he came in, of the 2 engines, 1 quit on final, and he landed that plane on 1 engine.
Wow. So Gary, part of the legacy of your uncle here is you've actually written a book about all his exploits.
This is the One-Eyed Gunner. It took probably about a 4-year period to finish that book. I had many trips to interview my uncle, talking to him about his experiences. He took it matter of fact. He was a professional gunfighter. That's what he did, and he did it very well. Otherwise, he wouldn't have survived, or his first or second crews wouldn't have survived.
So he's finally done his last tour, but really his war really wasn't over at that point. And I think war really didn't leave him for a very long time, if not his rest of his life.
The war had taken its toll. I mean, his stomach was burnt with adrenaline and booze. And so he had 3/4 of his stomach removed. And when he left the hospital, he just got on with his life. He started a bricklaying business. And he operated in the Chicago area for the rest of his working career. But a remarkable man, and always with a very positive attitude.
I think it's a great testament to your uncle's wartime career, and also being able to pull all those interesting stories and operational missions together in one book, and it certainly is a great read.
There was very little known about my uncle because he served with an English squadron. So I wanted my uncle recognized. And he, in fact, was Canada's top heavy bomber air gunner ace. From a Lancaster, that's highly unusual. In fact, there were only 3 of them in the history of Bomber Command.
So the logbook, the collection, what's the future? In my museum, we would love to have this example. It's a great Nova Scotian story. It's part of our mandate to tell the story of Atlantic Canadians, and particularly Nova Scotians, who did something extraordinary. In this case, your uncle did.
I want them to be on open display, not in a back room somewhere shuffled away and gathering dust, because Clarence Bentley Sutherland is a national Canadian hero who was never recognized for what he achieved and what he did, like many other heroes of the Second World War.
Absolutely, and that's part of the whole process. And obviously today, in presenting the audience and with the book, has certainly highlighted the story of Larry. And I appreciate, Gary, you bringing that to us, and I really appreciate you discussing it with us today.
Well, thank you very much.
The thing that stood out most was Gary's passion for his uncle and telling the story, but also being able to show that story through his medals, through his logbook, of being able to touch and feel those pages that Larry wrote his missions on and his success shooting down Luftwaffe aircraft. That is something you don't see every day.
It's so nice to interact with people that have a passion for our heroes. There's so many veterans that came back that got little recognition for what they did. And for me, that's a shame. But we have to remember their sacrifice, so that hopefully we don't do it again.
Coming up on Militaria.
There was a prison where they held people that were going up to trial to see if they were collaborators. My name's Patty Smart, and I brought in a cane that belonged to my father, Carl Mackenzie, that was given to him by a prisoner of war. After the war, instead of coming home, he elected to stay, and he was an escort guard for prisoners that were taken to the trials.
Canada still had work to do in Germany after the Nazis surrendered, ending the Second World War. Approximately 17,000 Canadian troops stayed to serve in the Allied occupation force. The Allies divided Germany and Austria into 4 occupation zones, administered by the Soviet Union, the US, France, and Britain. The Allies rounded up thousands of German men and women suspected of crimes, including involvement in the Nazis' horrific concentration camp system, and detained them for trial. Among the internment camps operated by the British, with Canadian assistance, was Esterwegen, a former concentration camp built by the Nazis.
So you've brought something for us to have a look at.
Yes.
What can you tell me about this?
This is a cane that was given to my father the year after the war. He was a prison guard that escorted prisoners to the war trials. This is the only thing that he brought back from the war.
As we can see, it's definitely a hand-carved piece. It's got some stars at the top, pig's head, and a snake going down it with a crest. Did you know anything about the individual that carved it?
No, just what Dad told me. The gentleman that made it, in appreciation for Father giving him the cigarettes that he hadn't had in a long time. He wasn't a soldier. I think he was a burgermeister of a small village. He never held grudges against the German citizenry. They weren't an enemy to him at this point.
Human beings are human beings. And in my personal opinion, the war had ended, and it's human nature, Why not? Why treat him as your enemy? The war is over and you can move on. And he was basically the local town burgermeister or mayor, so probably went along with things, but wasn't necessarily a war criminal. So Patty, this cane was produced in the town of Esterwegen. Is that correct?
I'm not sure if it was in Esterwegen. I think it's where the prisoner of war came from. And I believe there was a prison where they held people that were going up to trial to see if they were collaborators.
Esterwegen was actually opened in 1933 as one of the sub-camps of concentration camps. It was in operation until 1936 as a concentration camp, not a death camp, but a concentration camp for mostly political prisoners. In 1936, I believe it was handed over to the Justice Department in Germany, and they used it for political prisoners up until 1945. In the period that your father was there in 1946, it was used as a British internment camp for higher-ranking Nazi collaborators that, as you say, would have been awaiting trial and being investigated to see what their involvement in the war was. Esterwegen was part of the German camp system, concentration camp system that existed from the rise of Hitler, and when Hitler took power in 1933, they started opening a lot of these camps. After a while, these camps were made bigger, and they closed a lot of the smaller camps, and actually Esterwegen was a camp that was sold off by the SS to the German justice system to be used for political prisoners, and that money was actually used to start up Sachsenhausen concentration camp, which eventually became a death camp as well. What kind of relationship did your father have with the prisoner?
Well, he must have had a good relationship because he loaned him his knife.
Okay, to do the carving.
To do the carving.
Directly following the fall of the Third Reich, there was a non-fraternization order given out to all the Commonwealth, American, and Russian troops that were participating in the German campaign. In the beginning, that was the case, but after a while, young boys being young boys, of course, fraternization took place, and relationships were built right after the war. And the war had come to an end, and already the Cold War was looming. So I think a lot of people sensed that it was time to move on. Prisoner war art has a long tradition that goes back to the Napoleonic Wars. Prisoners at that time, both French and English, could produce small things such as this, and they could actually sell them to make money to pay for various things. Some of the more exotic examples are and well-known examples are the prisoner of war art carved ships that were done by French sailors, which are very, very detailed and actually quite expensive today. This is a great piece. It would be great if we knew more about the individual. We could actually do some research and maybe find out who that individual was. So Patty, what are your plans for the cane?
Well, they're going to go back to the 180-year-old house and hang on the entrance wall. And everybody that comes in can see it.
Excellent.
It will go to either grandson that I'm not sure. As I say, I may split it down the middle and give half to one who was a vet and the other half to the other.
I think it's a great piece. It's an important part of your family's history. I would suggest that you write everything down about the story and attach it, just so that part never gets lost. I do appreciate you bringing this in, and I really enjoyed talking about your dad.
Well, thank you. And I'm sorry that he's not here.
I would love to have talked to him.
Unfortunately, he died a year and a half ago, and but he would have had stories to tell you.
No, that's too bad.
Yeah.
Well, thanks again.
And thank you for having me, and Father's cane.